Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated chess player, and in this series we're playing rapid games on chess.com, going from 1000 to 2000 elo, and I'm trying to explain my thought process as best as I possibly can during the games for your entertainment and education. Today we're against ZY1420 from, I think that's Egypt, who has played e6 d6. Okay, I haven't seen this yet. It's like a weird version of the Pirc Defense, and I don't think we're going to do anything too strange. He's just moving a lot of pawns up one square. We're going to develop our knights. I'm developing the knights before my bishops because basically I know I want my pawns on e4, d4. I know I want my knights on c3 and f3, but I'm not quite sure where I want to put my bishops just yet. So my opponent goes a6. I mean, obviously this is bad because my opponent is neglecting his development, but there's no obvious way for us to break through just yet. If a knight lands on the f6 or c6 square, maybe there'll be breakthroughs with d5 or e5, targeting the knights and the pawn to try and break open the center somehow. But for the time being, let's just develop our pieces like this. Bishop come to e3, probably this bishop to d3. Okay, my opponent commits his first pawn forward with b5. I think the move a3 makes a lot of sense, just to stop this pawn from coming to b4. Now, we could just go bishop to d3, and if pawn b4 drop the knight back to e2, the e4 pawn will have enough defense. The knight can always hop over to g3 to help defend the pawn, and we could argue that this b4 pawn is weak. So I think I'm going to do that rather than rather than playing the move a3, just trying to keep my development as quick as possible. I also like the move queen to d2, which I'm going to play, because this h6 pawn could become weak in the future if my opponent castles kingside. Let's move g5, okay, that's a little bit risky. So the difference with g5 over b5, I think, is that b4 we can drop the knight back to e2, and we have no issues. But if g4, we can't drop this knight back to d2. So I'm going to play h3 to stop this pawn from coming forward. My opponent plays bishop to g7. So he's playing this very strange symmetrical structure, kind of like a hippo. I expect he'll put his knights on e7 and d7. And we'll see whether we can break through. Of course, that's going to be the goal. We need to decide how we're going to defend ourselves, whether we're going to castle queenside or castle kingside. We could just not castle at all, but I think it's probably wise to castle. I also like the prospect of playing f4 in the future to try and break apart my opponent's pawn chain over on the king side. I think I like castling queenside, and pawn to b4, I could meet with knight to a4. I can also meet with knight to e2. And I think I'm going to castle queenside. My opponent may strike with d5 or e5 at some point, but I don't think either of those moves work particularly well or are particularly scary. I don't think we need to be too concerned about those at all, considering how well developed we are. We have almost all our pieces activated. This rook is the only piece that's not immediately in the game. My opponent has two pieces developed. His king is safe for the time being, but let's say my opponent does nothing. If he does absolutely nothing, my next ideas are probably something like maybe like knight e2, knight h2, and f4, something along those lines, or maybe just knight h2 and f4 immediately. But my opponent goes pawn to b4. We're going to drop the knight back to e2. This pawn is guarded by the bishop, so that's not a problem. We could also put the knight on g3 to try and go to h5 to harass the bishop. If knight g3, knight f6 obviously controls the h5 square, which is a very valid idea. We could play the move bishop to b5 check, but c6, knight d7 moves like that, and I don't really see what we're accomplishing there. I think a lot of people would be tempted to play a move like e5 or d5 to grab space, but there's no real reason to do anything like that, because if I go e5, my opponent can just go d5 and lock everything shut. and the same with d5 and e5, which is why I mentioned the knights coming to c6 or f6, because if something like knight to f6, e5, my opponent can't just shut the center because his knight will be hanging, so he has to do something, which is important to note. I think I like the move knight to g3, and we're going to play it. One, it defends the e4 square, so my bishop isn't tied down to the defense. Two, it threatens to move knight to h5, which I think is a threat, because it makes this bishop's life very, very uncomfortable. And I think it probably forces the move knight to f6 to stop knight to h5. I mean, you can't play h5, so the rook defends that square because you'll hang your g5 pawn. But if knight to f6, can we play the move e5, like I mentioned before, trying to bait a knight into f6 so that we can forcibly break open the center? Because, of course, you can't play the move d5 because I will take your knight. So knight f6, e5, what can my opponent do? Well, if he moves his knight to a square like d7 to apply pressure to the pawn, I can just go knight to h4 attacking the bishop, and I have a very, very nice position there. If knight f6, e5 my opponent takes, we could take with the pawn, or we could take with the knight. If we take with the pawn, knight to d5 I would expect. We could play knight to h5, harassing the bishop again, if bishop to f8. I'm not sure what the follow-up is, but it does look like a nice position. This knight is relatively nice piece, though. If knight to f6, we could not play the move e5. Of course, we don't have to, but it feels like the right thing to do because, like I said, we have 6 pieces in the game ready to strike. My opponent has now only 1 piece. He undevelops the bishop so that I can't play knight to h5 harassing it. There is no way that's the right move. He could have let my knight come to h5 and then dropped the bishop back if that was his way of countering my idea. Very confusing. We could even play the move d5 here, and if e5 play knight to f5 ideas, that wouldn't be stupid, but again, I don't see the point in rushing that. There is absolutely no rush. What else can we do? What else can we do? Well, we can go for this plan of f4, like I said before. We could drop this knight back to h2. Let me think a sec. We could play h4, and after g4, of course trying not to open up the king side, knight to h2 attacks the pawn on g4, h5 defends the pawn, and then we have f3 forcibly opening the king side space. And we will open up the g file at least from one side. That looks quite nice. I'm going to play it. And I don't think my opponent will be able to survive an attack simply because of how undeveloped he is. He plays the move g4. I mean, if we drop the knight back, he could take on h4, which admittedly I didn't really consider. But I refuse to believe that that works. I mean, maybe we don't have to put the knight there. Like, we could put the knight somewhere else. E1 is a bit miserable, though, because the knight can't get back into the game. We could put the knight on g1 and rotate it via e2 into a square like f4. That's interesting. Oh, but surely my opponent can't take. Surely he can't get away with that. Can't we just play a move like bishop e2, attacking the g4 pawn, and then h5, knight g4 with a discovered attack on the queen? Yeah, I think that works fine. There's no way my opponent can play queen takes h4 successfully. And yeah, he plays the move h5. Now, if we go f3 immediately, then he might be able to take because this knight is undefended. But after knight takes g4 with a discovered attack on the queen, queen takes g3, bishop f4, then the queen is trapped. queen is trapped. So let's play f3. I I don't think my opponent will take. I don't think he'll take that pawn. No, he doesn't. Okay. Now I think it makes the most sense to take back with the knight. We could, of course, consider taking with the pawn and maybe putting a rook on the g file. I do, however, like knight takes because we prepare the move knight to g5, and that looks pretty nice. We also have ideas of d5 to free up the f5, which looks a little bit more dangerous. To be honest, an open f file I think is better than an open g file. We'll see what the computer has to say after the game, but because you could argue that taking with the g pawn on f3 makes sense because you're preparing pawn f4, pawn f5 to try and break open the e6 pawn. Okay, my opponent plays the move d5. Of course, it makes no sense to take here. We're going to push. I wouldn't be surprised if my opponent plays the move c5, but I don't think that works. And what happens now is our bishops, well, my light squared bishop in particular, really open up onto the king side. I've got ideas like rook f1 targeting f7 in conjunction with the move knight to g5. This position is crumbling for black. It is crumbling. It looks like he might be trying to castle queenside as quickly as he possibly can, which makes a whole lot of sense because he needs to try and get his king out of there ASAP. Can we stop him? Can we stop him? Rook f1, knight c6, knight g5. He can't castle because of knight takes f7, so knight to h6 defends. But then we can take on h5, and we have the knight coming to f6. So let's do it. Maybe removing the h-rook is a little bit better. Maybe. But personally, because of the line I just calculated, where I think there's a pretty good chance we end up winning this h4 pawn, I'd like this rook to be behind the h pawn, because if we win the h4 pawn, sorry, the h5 pawn, then our pawn on h4 will become a passed pawn. So I'd like to have the ability to shove it forwards as quickly as possible before my opponent can develop his pieces properly. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far and finding it educational and hopefully entertaining, then please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Really helps to motivate me to keep making these videos for you lot. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, then the link to the playlist will be down below. But okay, what is he going to do now? Because this seems like his whole idea. I don't see what else he could do. I mean, you could even consider after knight to c6 playing bishop to g5, trying to cut the king off. But I don't think that that is a very good idea because my opponent can just play probably bishop to e7 and block my bishop's control. And I don't really want to exchange too many pieces with my opponent because we have a massive space advantage, and it's a very well-known kind of principle in chess where if you lack space, then you should try and trade pieces to like minimize the damage of having less space, if that makes sense. Because your opponent can't make as much use of the space if they don't have as many pieces. Knight g5 looks like the logical move. Let's play it. The only other way, well, my opponent obviously can't go rook to h7 to defend. Knight h6, like I said, we take on h5, and that position looks incredible. The d4 pawn is defended, by the way. What was I saying? But upon knight to h6, we can just take on h5, and the knight is probably going to hop into the f6 square and cause a bit of chaos, or even come back to a square like f4 if needs be. Like, we're not tied down to any plan here. Also, wait a second. There's ideas here. Oh no, there isn't. No, sorry. I was thinking about ideas of sacking on f7 to try and draw the queen over and play bishop to g6. But my head mixed up the fact that I have my queen has a battery with this bishop, not with this bishop. But good to always look for sacrifices, because upon knight to h6, it wouldn't be completely ridiculous to have some kind of sacrifice on the f7 square to play like rook to f1 and try and completely destroy our opponent. But here I don't think that any of that works. I also don't think any of that is necessary, even if it does work. I think taking on h5 is the easiest way to go about this position. We're up a clean pawn. We have fantastic pieces. Not only are they developed, but they control like a lot of the board. Our pawn center is fantastic at controlling my opponent's position. He has a clear lack of space, which we're going to try and make him suffer with for the rest of the game. Knight to f6 almost traps the queen. The queen only has one square on e7. That is safe. I don't know what the follow-up is after knight f6, queen e7. Don't get me wrong, we have an amazing position. We're completely winning. Where's the knockout blow, though? Is there a knockout blow? I don't know. Maybe it makes sense just to double rooks to go after this f7 pawn. That looks pretty nice. Because, I mean, this knight could move and try and unleash an attack on this knight, but the knight can always come to f6 with tempo on the queen. So it might be one of those cases where the threat is stronger than the execution, where having the threat of knight to f6 is actually better than playing knight to f6. My opponent also can't really develop this bishop properly, because then the queen will be cut off from the f7 square, and we will win the f7 pawn. Queen f2 doesn't make as much sense because of knight to g4 with forks. So I suppose the only issue that we could have is knight g4. And I suppose that also stops knight to f6 because they cover that. Okay, that makes sense. We could consider the move rook to f4, guarding d4, guarding the g4 square, also guarding h4, and preparing rook h f1. If rook f4, my opponent can still play the move knight g4. I don't really want to let my opponent's rook get active though. So if rook f4, knight g4, what else can we do? We could always drop the knight back to g3. Like, we don't even have to put it on f6. We could just drop it back. My opponent will be forced to return. Oh no, because he can take my bishop. I don't think I want to let him take my bishop. So rook f4, knight g4, knight f6, knight takes, rook takes. Then my opponent has move. Oh no, he doesn't, because this knight no longer defends f7. So actually, wait, no. If rook f4, knight g4, we can just take on f7, attacking the queen. And after queen to e8, only move, then maybe knight to f6. Knight takes f6, rook takes f6, and we're attacking the e6 pawn quite a lot. Well, then we don't even have to put the rook on f4, though, because we don't care if the knight comes to g4, because if, like, let's say rook to f3, knight to g4, then we still just take on f7. It's the same line, but I think I prefer the rook on the f3 square, because it doesn't cut my bishop scope over here. I hope all of that makes sense, and it may be very minute details that don't necessarily matter, but not only do I want to try and play as accurately as I possibly can in these games, but I also want to try and provide interesting commentary, going over just interesting lines. Okay, the move rook to e8 obviously just blunders knight to f6, so we're going to play that immediately. That makes my life very, very easy. I don't know what else to say about that. Yeah, this is just a bit of an issue for my opponent. Queen e7. I mean, we could just take the rook. I don't think there's a need to complicate that, to be honest. And then rook h to f1, applying more pressure to f7. knight d8's the only real way to defend that. This looks completely winning. I mean, obviously it's completely winning, but like even more so. There's even ideas of bishop to b5 to try and apply loads of pressure to the knight and the queen, because the queen will end up on the e8 square after I take. And I don't think we need to think too hard about this. Let's just take the rook. A rook's a rook. Queen takes, of course. And rook h to f1 is a perfectly good move. We just attack. I do like the move bishop to b5 though, simply because knight to d8 then can't be played trying to help defend. If something like bishop b5 and queen e7 unpinning, then we just have an active bishop. The bishop's just more active than it was, also blocks this bishop's development. If something like bishop e5, bishop e7, I suppose that's playable. Rook f1. Well, I also like bishop e5. I'm going to play it because then our queen also defends the d4 square, so this bishop's free to go and do whatever it wants. So that's also a nice part of our position. Our queen isn't really doing anything. You don't need to use a queen to attack. Like, a lot of the time, the queen is more effective staying behind and kind of just watching everything from a distance, supporting other pieces, doing some of the dirty work, and then it can jump into the game out of nowhere. Like, let's just say some line where the queen goes to d3 and gets into a6 at an opportune moment. It doesn't have to be the star of the show. Okay, yeah, queen e7. I mean, that just blocks his own development. We're going to play rook h to f1, and he can defend the f7 pawn with the move knight to d8. I think that might be the only way to defend the f7 pawn properly. But, I mean, the defenses will only last so long. They'll only last so long. The queen can always come to f2 to support h4 and apply more pressure to the f7 pawn if it wants. Okay, I didn't actually consider the move knight to f5. That's a nice move. Although, can't I take on f7? Can't I take on f7? If the knight takes the bishop, we just take back, and then the knight is defended. If knight f7, queen f7, pawn g4 attacks the knight is pinned to the queen. The knight can't move in a way that targets my queen, which is very important. We could play g4 immediately, though. And after knight takes e3, play rook takes f7 intermezzo. There's no way for the queen to defend the knight by saving itself, which is important to note. And if pawn g4, knight takes h4, rook takes f7, the queen has to move. And if it goes to e8, then this pin comes back. And if it goes to d8, then the e6 pawn will fall. That's pretty nice. Let's play it. Pawn g4. Let's go. We want to open up this f-file. If I lose a pawn in the process, so what? So what? That's not important right now. The pawn is doing the job of defending the knight, of course, but my queen and my bishop are also doing that job. Like I said, I'm leaving the queen behind a little bit, but it's doing a bit of the dirty work. It's defending, but it's always ready to enter the game with a move like queen d3 or queen f2. Always ready to get in the game. Of course, sometimes the queen does lead the attack. Sometimes it does, but in this case, it doesn't have to. And we'll see what my opponent chooses to do here. He could bring the knight back to h6. It wouldn't be a good move, I don't think. We'd probably just take on f7. And my opponent's probably wasted his time if he goes back to h6. But I think more likely is taking on h4 or taking on e3. The thing is, though, even if my opponent takes on e3 and we take back rather than taking on f7, so my plan is take. But, oh, wait, no. If here, this isn't a good move because of knight to f1 attacking my queen. There are tricks still. Knights are tricky. knights are tricky. So if knight e3, it makes more sense just to take back, and the f7 pawn is under attack, and there is no way to defend it sufficiently. A move like knight to d8 doesn't work, we just take, 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 and yes, my opponent could take on h4, but then the bishop will hang. That's one of the issues with not developing your pieces properly, or developing them and then putting them back on their home square for some reason, which our opponent chose to do. I mean, my opponent's really just suffering the consequences of not developing his pieces. He shoved a load of pawns forward. We didn't really do anything spectacular. We just took the center, castled, and because of the moves my opponent made, there were potential pawn breaks with like f4, which I was considering. And he doesn't allow us to do that quite. But, you know, knight to g3, trying to get into the weak h5 square. My opponent retreats his bishop, and then we go for pawn breaks. Calculate tactics with queen takes h4, realize that they work in our favor. Here, again, they work in our favor. And then we just open up the lines and attack, attack, attack. My opponent goes knight to h6, and I think we just take on f7. If knight f7, knight g4, we just take the rook, so that's nice and easy. Let's take. I don't care if the h4 pawn falls in any of these lines. None of it works because of the weakness of the rook and the weakness of the bishop. And interestingly, like, this bishop is kind of tying down two of my opponent's pieces, which is quite nice. Because the knight can't really go anywhere, and this bishop needs to keep an eye on the knight, otherwise it's going to fall. Now, if my opponent hadn't shoved his b-pawn so far up the board, then the b-pawn would be defending the knight, and it wouldn't be as big of a deal. Like, if these pawns were back on, you know, a7 and b7, for example. But, okay. Let's see what my opponent does. Rook f7 is on the board. We're attacking the bishop, we're attacking the queen, we're attacking the knight. We have two connected passed pawns here. The queen has to keep an eye on the bishop, so it's going to have to drop back to e8 or d8. e8, of course, means that the knight is pinned to the queen, which is potentially bad. d8 leaves the queen vulnerable to bishop to g5 ideas, which is not great for him. Yeah, goes back. I think bishop g5 makes a lot of sense. Bishop g5, bishop e7. I can take on c6 because after bishop takes g5, I can take on b7 with check. And if bishop g5, bishop e7, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, then the bishop here is hanging because there's two attackers versus one defender. This is the importance of calculation and why the pressure here on the knight is so valuable. This bishop on d3 was good, but it's even better on b5. So let's take. Of course, bishop g5 does attack the queen, and the queen is technically pinned, but it doesn't matter because bishop to b7 comes first with check. Let's play it. King takes, and now we are just up a rook. I'm going to take here with the queen. Yeah, let's take with the queen. If my opponent trades queens with me, then we are just up a whole rook. And of course, we are completely winning. We are just going to either scoop up a bunch of pawns or try and push our own pawns. And if my opponent refuses the queen trade, he does accept the queen trade, then we're probably going to play a move like queen to g7 and just attack down the 7th rank. If my game decides to load properly and let me take, that would be fantastic. I'm just going to pause the video and refresh my tab. Okay, I think that's fixed it. Let's take. I don't know why my game does that sometimes. Like, it's really, really strange. It's chess. My computer should not struggle with this. I'm actually going to play the move rook to f4 here, which may seem like an unnecessary move, but I can't defend my g5 pawn, so I'd like to keep my g4 pawn on the board. And then I'm just going to play rook 7 to f6. This rook is defending my only weak pawns, and there's no way for my opponent to defend his e6 pawn. Then I will have two passed pawns, which my opponent will not be able to deal with at all. The king can always get into the game whenever it wants. My opponent's pawns obviously pose no threat. and I think he might resign pretty quickly, but of course it's still important not to make stupid blunders in these positions. If you do want to skip to the analysis section, the timestamp will be below, but if you want to stick around for this, then it'd be great to have you. Let's see what he does. Let's see what he does. I mean, there is nothing here for black, obviously. Let's take on e6. This is tempting, but it does drop the pawn, which seems unnecessary. I'm just going to bring the king, so the king can defend the pawn, and then this rook can get involved in the attack. Surprised my opponent hasn't resigned yet. I'll tell you what's interesting is, so far in this speed run, the quality of opponents that we've faced around this like 1200, 1300, 1400 level has been very impressive. Like, I'm rated like 2000 plus in rapid chess online, and I'm rated like 2000 in over the board classical chess. And some of these opponents at this rating range have been really, really strong. Like, it's been really nice to see, to be fair. Yeah, I don't really want to let my opponent take my pawns like that. So let's do this instead. I don't care if my opponent wins my d4 pawn, because there's no threat attached to it. If he wins like c2 and b2, then maybe he can start pushing this pawn through. But winning the d4 pawn doesn't really matter. I don't care about that. My king is stopping the rook from coming to g4, and we're just going to push this pawn through. There's very little that can be done about it from my opponent. This d-pawn poses absolutely no threat, of course. I'm kind of shocked we haven't seen a resignation yet. By the way, the growth of this channel recently has been absolutely mad. Like, really, really mad. I've gained like 1,000 subs in a week and a half or something. So, firstly, thank you so much to all of you, whether you're new to the channel or you've been watching for a while. I really appreciate it. I never really thought that this many people would be interested in me blabbing on about chess, but hopefully I am able to either be... I don't know if I'm being entertaining or educational, like, primarily. I try to be educational, but then stuff like not seeing a hanging rook happens, which happened in a few videos ago, which was kind of hilarious. So maybe you are here for the entertainment even. Oh, there's actually quite a nice checkmate here. I want my opponent to go king to a4 because queen to e8 would have been checkmate. But no, okay, he doesn't go there. Unfortunately, let's give a check. We can, of course, pick up the rook. But after king to b5, queen to b6 check, the king has one square, and then queen to c6 is checkmate because the king is surrounded by his own pawns, and these pawns keep the king off of my third rank. Very interesting game. Just based off of that, this could be a very high accuracy game, which for a Pirc defense is difficult to achieve because it's a hyper-modern opening, and there's so many like possibilities. There's like not many forced lines. It'd be very interesting to see what the computer thinks anyway. So let's get into the analysis. Okay, so game review gives 92.4% accuracy. My opponent with 81.7, which is pretty good to be fair on both sides. So let's dive into it. There's going to be a lot of mistakes on both sides just because of the nature of these hyper-modern openings. There's so many possibilities for both sides. It's very difficult for a human to be able to calculate everything or even consider everything, where the computer obviously is more able to do that. So, e4, d6, d4. My opponent goes e6, which I mean, objectively is not a good move because you just relinquish the entire center, but it isn't necessarily easy to take advantage of it with white. I think the easiest thing to do is just try and take as much space as possible. h6 definitely isn't the approach though. If you're going to play this small center setup, start developing your pieces. If you want to go for the fianchettoed bishops, do something like g6, b6 and develop, or get the knights into the game quickly, or bring one of the knights to f6 or one of the knights to c6, because if something like knight c6 and I try to go d5 a bit too early, my opponent can always trade and go knight e5 and black's okay. Black's okay. I mean, they're certainly worse. This d5 pawn is a bit annoying for black to deal with, but he's fine. h6 though, it's like one too many. I get a bit too big of a lead in development, but the game is certainly not over by any means. I have blundered several games where I've had a massive space advantage and my opponents just found a way through. That's how hypermodern openings work. But okay, a6, that's actually the best move. That's hilarious. How is that the best move? Bishop e3, b5. Again, I understand the point, but because after bishop d3, my opponent has no other pieces in the game. Let's say he had this kind of a setup, then b4, like b5 followed by b4 would be an issue, because he would have a lot of pressure on the e4 pawn, and I would have to move my knight back, and he would win a pawn. The problem is, he spent so much time playing all of these pawn moves that he doesn't have that kind of pressure on the center. If you're going to throw pawns forward, they need to work in conjunction with your pieces. He doesn't have any pieces, so his pawns aren't really as valuable, right? So bishop b7, queen d2. Apparently d5 here was good. I mean, the computer prefers kingside castle, and if my opponent went for the same plan, it wants to go d5, bishop g7, de6, fe6. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But what if, like, e5? Best move here is b4. Oh, I guess you want to play a4 and really chip away at this structure, but not let the pawn come to b4. That's interesting. And I suppose d5 locks this bishop away forever, so my opponent can't play d5 to unveil the bishop. But okay, I go queen d2, g5 is played, which is not a good move. The computer again wants to move pawn to d5. But I also don't think there's much of a rush. We go h3, which is the second best move. My opponent goes bishop to g7. And then we castle queenside. The computer wanted to play a4 to provoke the move b4 and then drop the knight back to e2. I suppose maybe with the same intention. Yeah, it is with the same intention of playing knight to g3. And if my opponent does something like castles kingside, the game is going to be over. Like, we can just sack the knight. If gf3, I assume gf3, we're going to maybe go like king e2, rook g1. And this is going to be complete devastation. Moves like knight to h5 are also very good. e5 would unleash the bishop. The queen can get in quite easily. This is unplayable. But we castle queenside. b4, knight e2. b4 is a bad move, by the way. My opponent has to waste more time going a5 to defend the pawn. I go knight g3. And here, bishop f8 was just a shocking move, to be honest. I don't get that at all. I mean, I understand why. My opponent is scared of the move knight to h5. There can be no other reason for it. But just go knight f6. Yeah, I might try and break the center open with e5, maybe. The computer doesn't love it. It thinks knight d5 is a good move, which is what I was trying to figure out. d5 is apparently better, and if e5, bishop b5. Ah, okay, my opponent doesn't have the c6 square, so knight b to d7 probably. Then just chip away, knight h2. There's a lot of pressure going on. Knight could be coming into f5, which is going to be very uncomfortable. But the whole point of knight g3 is, let's say my opponent plays knight to d7. I want to go knight to h5, attacking the bishop. The king could come to f8 to defend, but then I don't even have to take. The bishop isn't going anywhere. The only square it's got is f6, and I can just take it then if I want to. Or I can just leave the knight there because it's a nice piece. But if I go knight h5 and then the bishop comes back to f8, we get a very similar position to what we got in the game. My opponent kind of needed, in my opinion, to play the move knight f6, and the computer agrees, just to stop me from getting in. And then the game goes on. I'm a lot better, but the game is not over. Bishop f8, you have one piece developed. You can't play chess like that. I go h4, g4, knight h2. Here, if queen takes h4 is played, I have bishop e2, which is what I was calculating in the game. And I am threatening ideas like knight takes g4. So let's say knight d7 is played here. Knight takes g4. Queen is under attack. The queen has to drop back. and then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers on the h6 pawn, I will win the h6 pawn. I don't even have to take it, I suppose. I can do d5 even, bishop f3 the computer likes, even bishop g5 because you can't take because of the pin. You might be forced to play f6, which is very ugly. I think you can probably get away with just taking, but if everything is traded, for example, like white is up a pawn, but you know how I said earlier in the game that the side with a space disadvantage wants to trade pieces? Well, for the cost of a pawn, black has just traded off 3 pieces that were completely undeveloped for 3 of my pieces, which were absolutely beautiful. Not really worth the trade-off, but you still go up a pawn in that line. My opponent instead chooses to move h5, I play the move f3. My plan was, if queen h4, knight takes g4, you can't take because of take. If you take on g3, I have bishop to f4, and this queen cannot escape. Now, there is the move bishop h6, and I can't take because of take, but I can just take the bishop. And if knight takes or something like that, then I take on h5. You can't take because of takes. And the knight is under threat. There's no way to defend the knight. I'm completely winning regardless. And to be honest, bishop to h6 is a very, very difficult move to find anyway. But none of that happens. My opponent takes on f3. And here I take with the knight, which is the correct option. I did consider the move gf3 to maybe try and go something like pawn f4, pawn f5. Let's just say my opponent doesn't do anything here, and I get the move f5 in. The position is very uncomfortable for black, but it's still fine. Taking would be horrific because knight f5 and black is going to die. But if he just keeps developing normally, I don't know, queen e7. If I take, it's not the end of the world because I don't have access to the f5 square. But it is better to take with the knight because, of course, my opponent isn't just going to develop his knight and undevelop his knight. Although he did do that with the bishop, so maybe he would. Anyway, d5 by my opponent, trying to strike in the center. Like I said, bad idea to take. Watch the eval bar go from plus 3.5 to plus 2. There's no need to take. It just helps my opponent develop. So instead, we go e5. Not the best move, but still very good. I like the move e5 because it stops the knight from coming to f6 anyway. Queen d7. My opponent is trying to castle. And here I felt it necessary to try and be as quick as I possibly could with my attack. Because if I play a move like king b1, and my opponent gets knight c6, and I play a move like king a1, and my opponent manages to castle, I'm still winning, but the task becomes a little bit more difficult in my opinion. I really like the move rook d to f1, because after knight c6, knight g5, it's near impossible to defend this pawn properly. My opponent goes knight h6, and you're defending for the time being, but after knight takes h5, I'm up a pawn. My opponent does get to castle. Knight f6 was the best move here, and after queen e7, the move is knight g to h7, cutting the rook's connection to the knight. If the knight goes back to g8, then bishop g5 sets up skewers with the queen. If the knight comes to f5, I assume you actually take with the rook and then the bishop. And then bishop g5. That is brutal. Look at this. Oh my, that is horrific. I played rook f3. Computer thinks it's suboptimal, but I think it's simple. The only thing I had to watch out for was knight to g4, attacking my knight, and if I go knight f6, my opponent can trade with me. But I calculated correctly, and I was like, I can just go rook f7, and if the queen goes back, then knight f6, and then after knight f6, rook f6, I am up 2 pawns with a commanding position. My pieces are going to swarm very, very quickly. I have g4 and h5 ideas as well to support this pawn and cause a massive nuisance. My opponent goes rook e8. The best move in this position is knight takes d4, sacking a knight to play queen a4, and after king b1, b3. I don't... Oh, okay, then you attack the bishop. That's interesting. a b3, queen d4. I mean, you're still completely losing, but I suppose it makes it a little bit more complicated. Realistically, nobody in the history of ever is going to play that, except for like a GM or, I don't know, maybe an IM or something. Rook e8, knight f6 is a simple fork. Queen e7, takes, bishop b5. I loved this move, bishop b5, and the computer agrees with me because we just put a lot of pressure, and my bishop has served its role. It's done its job on this diagonal by stopping the rook from coming to h7 to defend, but now it's got a more important task. Queen e7. Makes sense, but you're blocking your own development of the bishop. Rook h2 f1. The computer likes to move king to b1, but it's unnecessary in my opinion. Knight f5, and here g4. The computer does also like the plan of knight takes f7. It is definitely still good, and if queen f7, g4, the knight can't move because it's pinned. So knight c to e7, bishop g5, putting pressure on the knight. It's overcomplicated though, just go g4. My opponent went back to h6. Now if knight takes e3, I initially was like, oh, rook f7. Look at the eval bar. It doesn't work because knight f1 I can't take because of take. There I'm probably losing. Yeah, I'm completely losing. My opponent has so many more pieces than me. So you have to be very careful. If knight takes e3, just take back. The f7 pawn is going nowhere. It can't advance because of en passant, and then e6 will fall. Be patient, be careful. Knight h4, we can take on f7, e6 is under attack, queen's under attack, bishop's under attack, queen e8 pins again, and here we can take on e6 and then take on f8 because we removed the defender. The game is completely over. But be careful. Knight h6 is played, which just makes our life very easy. Take. If the queen takes on h4, then the bishop hangs on f8, so the queen has to retreat back to d8 rather than e8 where it could get pinned. We go bishop g5, attacking the queen, and we're essentially baiting the move bishop to e7 because the only other move is to admit that you were wrong by playing queen to d8 and going back to e8. Again, pinning yourself against the knight. Queen f4 threatens the bishop. There's no good way to defend the bishop anyway because after bishop to e7, we can just take because of the pin. But we bait the move bishop e7, which my opponent plays. The computer thinks it's the best move. I mean, everything's lost for black anyway, but it makes our life very easy. Because after we take on c6, if my opponent takes back, then we take on e7, and we go up another piece. Are we up a piece already? No, we're up an exchange. We're up an exchange right now, and 2 pawns. But my opponent takes on g5, and we can actually do this first. Because I suppose if queen g5, hg5, bishop c6, we can force a rook trade, and the pawn cannot be stopped by the bishop in any way possible. Which is actually quite interesting. But simpler still is taking on b7, queen g5. My opponent, he can refuse the queen trade, but what else is he going to do? Like queen e8, I could even just insist on a queen trade with queen e7. And like, if you go queen to c8 to try and defend your c7 pawn, there's rook f8. And after takes and takes, the queen is trapped in its own territory. My opponent doesn't really have a choice. He has to trade queens with me, really, but of course the game is over. Rook g8, I go rook 1 to f4, which is the best move. I can't defend this pawn, but I might as well preemptively defend these pawns. Rook 7 f6, king b6, take, c6. The game is kind of done anyway. I do like my idea of covering up the second rank and playing king to f4, which the computer also likes, just giving up the d4 pawn because it's not important. The computer approves of this, and we push the g pawn. My opponent has no way of stopping it, and did I just miss a mate in 1? I missed a mate in 1. I really wanted to mate my opponent on on a4, because I thought it was quite funny. I thought it was quite a funny mate, because we're kind of so far away from the king, but it's boxed in by all of the pawns over here. That's the game. we didn't do anything special. I think that's kind of like one of the running themes of this speedrun is not doing anything too special, just applying pressure, attacking pieces, and taking the opportunities when we get kind of gifted them. You create your own luck in chess, of course. If you ask questions, eventually your opponent will answer wrong. Nothing special though. No reason you guys can't do it. If you want to check out the previous episodes of the speedrun, playlist is down below. Check out this video that's going to appear on your screen now, because YouTube thinks you're really going to like it, and subscribe if you haven't already.